Hi, it's Mike Stevenson here. Today I want to talk about an update from the Azure updates that kind of caught my eye about using Azure functions to do change tracking on MySQL. So let's imagine, just for argument's sake, we've got a scenario where we're going to detect changes in Azure MySQL database, and we want to sync them to something like CRM. So here, this is the update that caught my eye in Azure updates. So basically, we're saying we can use MySQL triggers for functions. So I'm going to assume there's a new binding here, and we're going to have a look at that in a moment. And you can trigger on a MySQL table when it's a record's created, updated, or deleted. So that if you're using MySQL, that opens up quite a few scenarios here. Now, if we look at how this gets implemented, so here I've got my MySQL database and I've got a table that I'm going to drive these changes from. So the first thing I need to do is we need to run a SQL statement here. So let's pretend we've got a product table and we're going to basically do an update to add a column to that table, which will basically be used to track the records. So we'll update that in the database. So we've got a table with a new column on it. Now, over in my Azure functions over here, so we've got the MySQL extension, and we've got a function here which is going to trigger based on the MySQL trigger. If you spot that here, so we've said we've got a table called products, and we can supply a reference to our connection string. And here, if you notice, actually, I'll just rub that line out just to make it easier to see. So here, this bit shows we've got an object in .NET called product, which is going to reference or represent the table in the MySQL database. So when our function spins up, what's going to happen is behind the scenes, the function's going to be polling this table, looking for changes. It's going to use the function updated field to know, like kind of almost keep track of how far through the updates it's got. And then when it detects changes, so let's pretend I write a new record in here. The function's going to detect that record, so there's going to be some kind of polling interval that you can configure with this binding. And what will happen is that's going to trigger my function, and then here I can do a loop. So I'll loop over each change in the product table, and you can see here where it's referencing out, the name and the product ID and stuff like that. But what we would do here, if we want to sync these to Dynamics, is we'd write some code in there to basically make a call to Dynamics, so that when we update our MySQL table, each of these products gets changed, added, updated. We can start syncing these changes into the database, and that would support sync with Dynamics. So it'll be a nice event-driven mechanism for doing that. So this looks really cool for me. This is a nice update. We always like these kind of patterns for being able to sync between systems. It might be a really good one where, something like a master child scenario might be I update my MySQL table, but I maybe instead of pushing these out directly into database, I might actually send them out to service bus. And that would be a good way of doing a pub sub pattern, so we could send these updates to different systems. Might be quite a good way of doing it. Now, it did make me think about other ways of doing this. So what I did notice is, obviously in Logic Apps, we've got a MySQL trigger as well. So in Logic Apps Standard, you can use things like when an item's created or deleted. And what you might do, again, you've got this idea of a loop, and then you might put connectors in. So I'm making HTTP calls to the Zendesk API, and I can use the Dataverse trigger. I think one thing to be aware of is the key difference between these is that in the function app one, that's a new binding, whereas if I'm looking at the Logic app here, what I actually do currently is this is an API connection. Now this is a cloud connector type, as opposed to the function binder, which is like a built-in connector. So one of the questions I've got for the Logic App team over here would be, is that binding going to become supported for Logic Apps? Because this cloud connector is basically a call out from my Logic app, calls the API, checks the function. So it's just that extra hop in being able to check whether there's a record in the database here. So I think it would be really cool if the Logic app team starts supporting that binding, takes one of the deployment artifacts out of the equation, which would be really nice. But hats off to the Function app team for bringing a new binding that'll help simplify some of these, especially things like reference data or transactional data where you want to push these updates out to other systems. This is a really good update. Thank you for listening to this video. Have a great week.